Hello and welcome to the Museum of Zoology's Winter Wildlife Livestream 2023. I'm Roz and I have loads of winter wildlife gems to share with you today, including beautiful poems by members of our Young Zoologists Club for 6 to 12-year-olds, atmospheric soundscapes by our Zoology Club members for 13 to 18-year-olds, and of course your chance to ask our Curator of Ornithology, Professor Daniel Field, all your burning questions about birds. So do pop them in the comments on YouTube and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. Now today's live stream is all about the winter wildlife that we have on our doorstep. Nature is absolutely amazing and we can find it everywhere. So even on our really concretey site here at the museum in the middle of Cambridge, at lunchtime today I spotted a couple of gorgeous little pied wagtails, called wagtails because they wag their tail up and down when they're moving around. I've got one on display behind me, just here. It's tiny, so if you want to see it in more detail you'll have to come and visit us. I saw a pair of those just having a lovely flutter around near the main entrance of the museum. And then when I was leaving home this morning to come to work, I was greeted by the sound of hundreds of starlings chattering away in the trees on my road. It was like 100 different conversations all going on at the same time, and it really made me smile. We also have a starling on display in here as well. It's just behind me here in this display. And starlings, when you look at them up close, they are the most beautiful birds. Their feathers are all shimmery. They shimmer every colour of the rainbow. And they're scattered with lots of little white spots, like a Milky Way of stars. And that's where they get their name starling from. I absolutely love all of those birds that we see in winter. So if you've seen any really interesting animals or something that you thought was really fun recently outside when you've been out and about, do let us know. Just pop it in the comments. We love to hear about your wildlife spots. So winter is far from empty of wildlife. Different animals have different ways of coping with the cold in this country. And today we'd like you to choose the best winter strategy. To help you, 4 of our team here in the museum have chosen their favourites, and we'll have a vote after you've seen them all. So to start, here is Matt with winter strategy number 1, hibernating like a hedgehog.
Personally speaking, after a long year, I could do with an extended nap. So if I could pick a strategy to get through the dark winter months, it would be that of the hedgehog. Hibernation for the hedgehog may begin around October, November, but the preparation began months before by eating enough to gain sufficient fat reserves to make it through the colder months. They need to weigh at least 600 grams, or they might not have the energy to make it through the colder months. I think this one might be okay. A good nesting site is also selected, somewhere such as a compost heap or underneath dense foliage, which they pack full of vegetation to help them stay warm. Once they begin their hibernation, they will enter a state of torpor, dropping their heart rate and temperature considerably, down to as low as 10 degrees Celsius. But they're restless sleepers. Occasionally they will wake up if disturbed, or if the climate is warmer, or indeed cold enough that they're in danger of freezing. But they will take the opportunity to seek more food and water to recharge their reserves. Usually they come out of hibernation around March, by which time they may have lost 1/3 of their body weight. Now, all this talk of hibernation is making me feel sleepy, and as I can't enter a state of torpor, I'm off to get a coffee.
I have to confess that snuggling down and going to sleep for a couple of months sounds like heaven over winter to me. This is a trick not only of hedgehogs, but also of bats and dormice. And it's not just mammals that go into a state of torpor over winter. Some butterflies overwinter as adults this way. So butterflies like peacocks and brimstones, and they'll be some of the first butterflies that you'll see on the wing in the spring. Other butterflies overwinter as caterpillars or pupae, and some do something even more extraordinary. And here we've got Esme from the museum, who is here with our second winter strategy inspired by butterflies.
I think the best strategy to cope with a cold winter like we get here in the UK is not really to have to cope with it at all, and I would do what a butterfly called the painted lady does. It migrates away from the UK in about autumn time before it starts to get too cold, And this is because the painted lady cannot survive our winter. When it starts to get too cold, butterflies and other insects can't fly, they can't feed, and often they can die as well. And so the painted lady leaves. It heads south into Europe and further still towards even tropical Africa, where it's really nice and warm and it can keep on surviving. And this not only benefits the butterfly themselves, but also their offspring. So along the way, the painted lady will reproduce and lay their eggs. So it's not only the butterfly itself that helps survive by migrating away, it's also its offspring that have a better chance of surviving away from the cold British winter.
Now, of course, butterflies aren't the only animals to migrate. In fact, when I think of migration, my mind immediately turns to something like a swift, and we've got one on display above me. Ooh, just up there. There we go, in our display there. This one in display, so we have them around our buildings, where we actually have swift boxes on our building here. And swifts arrive in the UK in April or May. They find a nesting site and they breed. And for me, one of the sights of summer over Cambridge is the shape, the silhouettes of our swifts in the sky, particularly if it's a nice sunny day with a blue sky, and you see them with their long, curved, pointed wings in the sky. But they're not here for very long, and by August, they're heading back to Africa, where they're going to spend the winter feeding. Now, we may think on days, particularly days like today, it's been a bit chilly here today, that our winters get really cold. But there are places that are a lot colder than the UK. And we actually get lots of winter migrants who come here to escape the colder winters where they live for the rest of the year. So we have things like hooper swans and Buick swans who come here from Iceland and come and spend the winter on our wetlands. And we also have things like redwing and fieldfare. We have a couple of these in our displays behind me here. These are winter thrushes that we get in this country, and they'll be coming to feed on berries in our hedgerows and things like that. These are just some of the stories that inspired members of our Young Zoologists Club for 6 to 12-year-olds at recent poetry workshops to create a pair of group poems with poet Hannah Walker. Here is the first, and I think it the perfect accompaniment to a nice cup of hot chocolate.
There is a way through, a group poem by a University Museum of Zoology, Young Zoologists. As winter comes across the ground, as nature steps beyond the green, condensation gathers on kitchen windows, families at tables, animals in burrows, ice holds solid in air.
And outside that big sky, nights that kick and fizz the moon, the slice of red wing against the sharp blue. Dog rose, holly apple, hawfinch, woodpecker, roe deer, there is a way through.
Above the city din, listen for the grey inside clouds, the dark chestnut down in soil, the mushroom shade of attic eaves, the robins know how, that first call out, ruby jewel berry clutches, foxes and polytunnels, dormice, wasps, woodlice, wrap up, wrap in, songs and chatter quieten. Tuck your neck, tuck it in. Sometimes snowflakes dance in wind, sometimes icicles swing in gutterings. Iridescence of starlings, hieroglyphics in oak, owls sing us to sleep. Nooks, crevices, centipedes deep under leaves, hold flocks overseas. As winter settles in the ground, as nature roots down into green, hold your heartbeat, turn it in. Wait for the dark, such blackness. The owls sing us to sleep. The robin questions everything. There is a way through, a line along the sun. A quarter turn until the light starts to lift. Gaps in cloud, the swallows from the east. It's time to begin, time to lift. Faces up out of darkness as winter comes across the ground. As nature steps beyond the green, there is a way through, you have to go in.
Wasn't that just lovely? Huge thank you to the Young Zoologists for your words and voices, and to Hannah for pulling them together into a poem. Now back to our winter strategies. We've had hibernation and migration so far, but what if you choose to stay here and stay active? How are you going to find enough food to eat? Here's Jack with strategy number 3.
And I love winter, so I wouldn't want to fly away somewhere warm and miss it or sleep all the way through it. So I would do what squirrels do, and that's prepare for winter by hiding food. So winter always, I think, involves a huge amount of eating. But of course, if you live out in the wilds, there's not a lot of food around in winter. So what squirrels do, both the greys and the reds that we have in this country, what they do is they have a very, very busy autumn, hunting around for acorns and hazelnuts and other kind of nuts, and then burying them so that they can feed themselves all the way through winter. It's really amazing adaptation. So squirrels, despite having such little hands, are very, very good at using them to dig little holes and then burying their nuts in them. What's most impressive is that they might bury thousands of nuts over the course of an autumn, and then they remember where they are. So squirrels have incredible memories, and they use visual clues to help map where they've buried their treasure, their food. And then months later they can come back and find it and dig it up again. And they do really, really clever, sneaky things where if they think another squirrel is watching them and that other squirrel might steal the food that they have buried, they will pretend to bury food if they think they're being watched. And then once they've pretended to bury a nut, they'll run off somewhere else where they're not being watched and actually really bury their food. Sometimes they do forget where some of the nuts have been buried, but that's fine, because that just means that little acorns and nuts have been dug into a perfect pit, and they can obviously then grow into a tree.
So squirrels aren't the only animals to do this clever trick. Some of our cleverest birds do it too, like the jay. We've got one on display just up here. This is our most colourful corvid that we have in the UK, and I find this time of year a great time of year for jay spotting, as they come to the ground to bury acorns. I spotted several recently on Jesus Green. And I noticed in the comments that some of you have seen some other birds as well. Some of you have seen some of my favourites, which are goldfinches. I absolutely love goldfinches. So very, very lucky for you to have seen those as well. So this brings us to our final winter strategy. And here is Sarah with strategy number 4.
A number of animals gather together in large numbers to overwinter. For UK urban spaces, that is often the smaller creatures like snails and ladybirds. Garden snails have a strong homing instinct that will have them find a sheltered space. They will then retreat into their shell and push out a mucus that dries out and hardens. This creates a seal around the opening and protects them from the cold, but also attaches them to the surface that they're on. They can also alter the chemicals in their blood so that their soft tissues don't freeze when the temperature falls below freezing. Some species of ladybirds will gather in large numbers and hibernate together. The invasive harlequin ladybird is well known for doing this around our windowsills. But the native 10-spot ladybird also does this either in wooden sheds or under loose bark. It's not well known why these cold-blooded animals cluster in this way, as they cannot share body heat like mammals and birds. However, scientists ponder whether hibernating or overwintering in large groups helps to better regulate the environment or air around them and increase their chance of survival. So my winning winter strategy is to have friends to wait it all out with.
So now we've seen all 4 strategies, it's time for you to start voting. So I'm going to click over to a QR code that you can scan in to take to our voting page. I'll just do this for a few moments. So hopefully you were able to scan that QR code in that time. If not, you can go to slido.com and enter the code 1816088. Or you can click on the link that has been put into the into the chat as well at the moment. So if you go to that poll, choose your favourite one. We'll give you the results of the poll at the end of our chat with Daniel Field today. So you've got plenty of time to choose. So which one do you think you'll choose? Will it be hibernation, migration, caching food, or waiting it out with a friend? So I'll just pop that slide up again in case you missed the QR code. Okay, so it's nearly time for the main event tonight, our conversation with Professor Daniel Field, our Curator of Ornithology and our friendly bird expert here at the museum. He's here to answer your questions, so do pop them into the comments. And to introduce you to Daniel, here he is to tell you a bit about his research and his favourite feathered friends.
Hi, my name is Daniel Field. I'm the Strickland Curator of Ornithology at the University of Cambridge Museum of Zoology, and I'm also a professor of vertebrate paleontology here at the museum. So I've been interested in birds for pretty much my entire life. I grew up in Canada, and I really distinctly remember seeing the blue jay for the first time when I was 4 years old, and I've been more or less hooked on birds ever since. Well, the research that I do now as professor here at the university is focused on trying to understand how and when and where the incredible diversity of living birds came to be. In fact, birds are the most diverse group of tetrapod animals in the whole world. There are about 11,000 living species, and you can see them almost anywhere you go, from the open ocean to just about the North and South Poles, to deserts, to rainforests, to urban places like the middle of Cambridge. We use information from living birds as well as observations of modern bird biology, combined with information from the fossil record to try to better understand how the incredible diversity of birds alive today first came to be. And the collection behind the scenes at the University Museum of Zoology is a really amazing place to come and learn about birds, because we've got between about 30 and 40,000 stuffed specimens of birds behind the scenes, as well as about 50,000 eggs and about 1,000 bird skeletons. So much of the work that we do in my research group studies these specimens that we have in the museum in order to draw new insights into the anatomy of birds and their skeletons, so that we can use that information to understand fossil birds better. But some of the birds behind me are some of my very favorite birds in the entire world. So you can divide the about 11,000 living species of birds into roughly 250 or so major bird families. And behind me, this taxidermy display shows many of these major divisions of the living bird family tree, which include one of my favorite species, this gigantic bird here called the shoebill. You can probably understand where that name comes from. It looks almost like it's got a Dutch clog for a face, and it was previously thought to be closely related to storks, but we now understand that its closest relatives are actually pelicans. This amazing hornbill up here. So this hornbill is a species called the wreathed hornbill, and it's a special one for me because just in September, I was helping teach on a zoology field course that went to Borneo. And Borneo is one of the best places in the whole world to see hornbills. So many days when we were in the field camp in the month of September, we had these magnificent wreathed hornbills flying over our heads, and they're so large that their wings make this amazing sound when they fly over. They're really, really noisy. Some of my other favorite birds that you can see on display here include the world's smallest penguin species. This is called the little blue penguin, and it actually is blue. Its feathers are structurally colored. So that's the world's smallest penguin species. But just earlier this year, I happened to be part of a team that named the largest fossil penguin species of all time. So we discovered a penguin called Kumimanu fordyci, which we estimate would have weighed over 150 kilograms. So this was an absolutely enormous fossil penguin. And the fact that we've got penguins around today goes to show that penguins have been a very successful, flightless, marine group of birds for many, many millions of years. In fact, the oldest penguins that we know of are roughly 61 or 62 million years old. So the winter is a really exciting time to see birds around Cambridge here. I love seeing some of the winter migrants arriving. So I've seen lots of really big flocks of winter thrushes, things like redwings and fieldfare. And just around Cambridge, you can see some really nice bird diversity without going too far. In fact, just in central Cambridge, places like the Mill Road Cemetery and the Paradise Local Nature Reserve are really amazing places to see winter birds. But if you're able to travel slightly further afield, there are some wonderful nature reserves very close to Cambridge that are terrific for seeing birds in winter. I really like Ouse Fen, RSPB, which is just north of Cambridge in the Fens, or Fen-Drayton Lakes, RSPB, another really amazing place close to Cambridge, to see a good diversity of birds, including really exciting waterfowl that arrive for the winter.
I'm joined now live by Daniel Field. Hello, welcome to Winter Wildlife.
Hi Roz, thanks very much for having me.
Okay. So I've got a few questions, and then when we get some questions coming in from our audience, because I know you're all going to have some burning questions for Daniel, we'll get to those as well. But I've got a few that I want to ask. So
please do.
You can see from your film that you really like birds. I mean, who doesn't? They're great. Was there a particular moment where you thought, I want to find out more about these animals?
There was. So I think I mentioned in that video the first bird sighting that I can clearly recall, and I was seeing a blue jay when I was 4 years old. But when I was about 9, I remember seeing a very puzzling yellow bird in my backyard in Alberta in Canada, where I grew up. And I'd never seen a bird like that before. I was really amazed to find out that they came in yellow like that. And I knew we had an old, not very frequently touched bird guide on the shelf in our living room, which I'd never really looked at before. And so I took it down to see if I could find that bird, and I did. It turned out to be a bird that's still very special to me, a bird called a yellow warbler, which is a common North American bird in the summer. But in the process of looking up that bird, I remember very clearly seeing all of these incredible birds that I'd never even imagined before, including one that really sticks out in my mind that I just saw in the book called a painted bunting, which is amazing. It's a small little songbird like this, but it's almost every color of the rainbow. And seeing that at the age of 9 really got me curious, not just about birds, but about this sort of hidden world of biodiversity that I didn't know about before. All of these organisms that lived in places other than where I grew up. And that got me really interested in trying to sort of imagine myself seeing these exotic animals at some point in my life.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, those books are so important. I remember finding those books on the shelves at home and just looking through them, and it really enthusing me about animals as well. So,
yeah, it was really inspiring.
It was really inspiring. Fantastic. We've already had a question come in, so I'm going to move to that one next. So Kathleen, this is not so much a question, but you're very lucky, Kathleen. She says we have 2 red kites and 3 buzzards that fly over our garden, and saw 4 foxgloves playing a few months ago. Yeah, that's really lucky. That's a fantastic garden you must have to have all of those. Yeah. Brilliant. So I have another question. You said there are 11,000 species of birds. It's a pretty diverse group of animals. Is there something in particular about birds that seems to make them so successful?
Well, the evolutionary history of birds is something that I'm particularly interested in, and in fact that's what my research group here at Cambridge focuses on primarily. And so we're interested in trying to understand how this amazing diversity first came to be. And for me, one of the aspects of the origin of bird biodiversity that I find so interesting is really trying to think about how it all got started. And our research and research of colleagues around the world suggests that one event in the history of our planet in particular was especially influential for stimulating this diversification of modern birds. And that was the extinction of the giant dinosaurs about 66 million years ago. So as far as we can tell, the group that includes modern birds seem to have diversified very, very rapidly in the aftermath of this big extinction event. And so it's within only a few million years of this asteroid that wiped out the giant dinosaurs that we start to see the earliest fossil representatives of groups that we recognize as sort of modern birds. Things like penguins, for instance, turn up about 61 or 62 million years ago. So to me, the extinction of the dinosaurs is one of these amazing factors that in so many ways seems like it doesn't have anything at all to do with the birds that we see in our garden today. But actually, those things are actually intimately linked over many, many tens of millions of years.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'd never linked the two together, but that's because I don't know anything like as much about bird evolution as you do. But that's amazing. So yeah, that extinction, and I know that our audience already know that birds are dinosaurs. I know that you know
That's
that.
right. So I need to be very careful when I
Yes.
talk about this extinction, because it's important to be very clear that we're talking about the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got quite a few questions coming, so I'm going to ask you some
Okay.
of these. So Anna asks, why do some birds have such vibrant colours, and are there any that glow in the dark? That would be amazing.
Well, there are birds that have feathers that reflect under UV light, that fluoresce under UV light. So one of the really amazing things about bird vision is that whereas we have 3 different kinds of cones in our eyes, red, blue, and green, that allow us to perceive the entire spectrum of colors that we can visualize, you can basically draw a little triangular diagram like this with red at one corner, blue at one corner, and green at one corner, and plot any color that we as humans can see on that diagram. Birds have a 4th kind of cone that is optimized for absorption within the UV, so very high energy wavelengths, and that allows a 3rd dimension to this color space to be accessed. So the colors that birds can see include an entire dimension of coloration that we cannot even really imagine. Yeah. But by looking at the regions of bird plumage that fluoresce under UV, we can get a sense of just how common these colors that we can't perceive are. And many birds, even colorful birds that to us look like they are, rainbow colored, actually have additional colors that we can't even perceive. So it really is amazing. And certain birds that look to us to be relatively plain actually have certain patterns on their bodies that are only perceptible if you're capable of visualizing UV light. So it is a pretty amazing thing. But then again, some birds are just totally drab, and there are good reasons for that. Many birds have relatively cryptic coloration, especially if they're nocturnal. So if we think of things like nightjars, these are birds that are not active during the day. So during the day, they really need to hide. They don't want predators to see them during the day. They're active at night. So a nightjar is relatively dark, its plumage is sort of mottled, and it's really perfect for blending in with dead leaves or pine needles or something like that on the forest floor to remain undetected during the day.
Fantastic. Oh, yeah, amazing. They are. I mean, I've seen photos of nightjars. I'm like, where is it?
Exactly.
It's really hard to see them in the daytime.
They're very good at what they do.
Really good. And when it comes to sort of the brightly coloured birds, is it things like, I mean, I know there are some species where the really bright ones are the males because they're showing off. What about in the species where they're both brightly coloured? Because we get some of those as well.
I think very often the answer to that just has to do with preference. I think birds are visual animals. I think they're capable of perceiving beauty just as we are. And I think that colorful females and colorful males are probably perceived as beautiful to potential mates in the bird world. And I think that's something that we shouldn't really overlook.
Yeah, absolutely. Birds can see beauty as well as we can. It's not a human thing to see beauty.
Absolutely. Yeah. But just to bring those two things together, if I may, one of the things about birds that I find most fascinating is trying to understand how the different groups of birds are related to one another. And one discovery that's been made over the last 10-15 years is that hummingbirds, which are among the most colorful birds that we can imagine, are actually very closely related to these cryptically colored birds like nightjars and other cryptic nocturnal groups like frogmouths that some of you may have heard of, owlet nightjars and the oilbird and potoos, which live in South America. So these are all cryptic nocturnal birds, and some of their closest relatives are hummingbirds. And it seems like hummingbirds, which are so brightly colored, evolved from these nocturnal, very cryptic ancestors, which suggests that their bright coloration and the fact that they're active during the day, those are features that evolved very late in hummingbird evolutionary history. So they're totally different from their close relatives like nightjars. But it just goes to show how variable this one group of birds that we call Strysaures is. It's one of the most interesting groups of birds, I think.
Yeah, I recommend having a look for pictures of hummingbirds and nightjars, and they look completely different.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fascinating. So we've got quite a lot of other questions.
Okay.
We've got loads. Jude in Sydney asked, when did the first bird evolve?
Well, it depends exactly what you mean by the first bird, but very often people will say that a fossil named Archaeopteryx was the earliest bird. So Archaeopteryx is a very early bird in many ways, basically no matter how you slice it. It is among the very oldest, truly bird-like feathered dinosaurs that we know of in the fossil record. It's 150 million years old, so extremely, extremely ancient. It's also very distantly related to modern birds among bird-like dinosaurs, so it's sort of like an ancient thing in that regard as well. But it also happens to be the very first truly bird-like dinosaur known from the Mesozoic era, or the age of dinosaurs. So it was actually first named in 1861. Wow. So it has been known for a really, really long time. And the interesting thing about the year 1861 to me is that that's only 2 years after Charles Darwin, famous Cambridge person, published On the Origin of Species. So Archaeopteryx, this very early bird-like form that combines in many ways features that are much more reminiscent of non-avian dinosaurs with features that are clearly reminiscent of birds, like large feathered wings. It appeared only 2 years after On the Origin of Species was published, so you can imagine that Charles Darwin in 1861 was very interested in that discovery. And of course, one of the most important early specimens of Archaeopteryx is visible in this country. It's on display in the Treasures Gallery at the Natural History Museum in South Kensington in London. And it's one of the most remarkable fossils, I think, on the island of Great Britain.
Yeah, it's exciting because you see all the feathers and everything. It's beautiful.
It's an extraordinarily well-preserved fossil, especially when you consider just how old it is, being 150 million years old.
Yeah, I can imagine Charles Darwin saying, "I told you so."
Exactly.
when they found that. So Roberto asks, could you talk a little bit about birds using tools?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the, I think, red herrings that people like to discuss when they talk about how special humans are in nature is the fact that we use tools and other organisms don't. And that just is only true if you're not looking very hard, and different groups of birds are capable of using tools to perform various tasks. Most famously, the New Caledonian crow has been shown to be able to modify things like sticks in order to perform certain tasks, especially to get food. But in the Galapagos Islands, birds like the woodpecker finch use branches and cactus spines in order to access things like grubs. So birds are capable of using tools, but certain groups of birds are probably more suited to it than others. So one thing that we know about birds is there's quite a lot of variation in terms of how intelligent they are. So we can do things like estimate the volume of a bird's brain and compare the size of its brain to the size of its body. And that, we call it the encephalization quotient, is a reasonable indicator of things like an organism's capacity for behavioral complexity. And some groups of birds have particularly high behavioral complexity and particularly high encephalization quotients. And the two groups that come to mind are parrots, first of all, which probably won't come as a surprise to many viewers, but also the group that includes crows, like the New Caledonian crow, as well as things like ravens, jays, and magpies. And that's a group of birds that we call corvids. And corvids, when you compare the relative size of their brain to their size of their bodies, is not very different from non-human primates in terms of their encephalization quotients. So it's probably reasonable to think of parrots and corvids as the hominids of the bird world, in a sense. They're particularly intelligent, and that has a lot to do with just how large their brains are compared to their body size.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that's evolved separately because they're not very closely related, are they?
No, yes, exactly. Those are features that evolved separately. Yeah. So parrots and corvids, which are a group of songbirds or perching birds, even though most corvids don't make very beautiful songs, are not particularly closely related. Yeah. So these very, very large encephalization quotients arose independently of one another.
Oh, so handy thing to have.
Yeah.
Then. Okay, Jude and Finn ask, what's your favourite bird? It's probably the most difficult question I find to answer.
Yeah, well, I don't think I can list 11,000 birds off the top of my head. There are a few birds that are really special to me. Generally speaking, I find birds to be most interesting when they are particularly distinct in some way. And the way in which I am most interested in kind of the distinctiveness of birds is in terms of their evolutionary distinctiveness. So the birds that have been evolving on their own for the longest, which makes them the least like any other group of living birds. And there's one bird species on planet Earth that has not shared a common ancestor with any living relatives for a very, very long time. And that is a bird that lives in South America called the Hoatzin. And our work suggests that the Hoatzin, which is a very unusual bird in many ways, last shared a common ancestor with another living bird species about 66 million years ago. So right around the time that asteroid wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. So the most evolutionarily distinctive bird alive today is the Hoatzin, and that's a bird that I've been particularly interested in for a long time. And I did get to see it exactly 10 years ago.
Wow.
I was in the Amazon in Ecuador, and Hoatzins are relatively common in pretty remote places, but relatively common around oxbow lakes in the Amazon. And so it was amazing to actually have a chance to see these birds that are really unlike any other bird alive today.
Yeah, it's amazing. They are incredible. We've got one on display upstairs, so next time you come to the museum, check it out.
That's right.
Yeah, they're amazing. So Jude in Sydney asked, do birds have a good sense of smell?
Well, some birds do, and some birds don't. And so this gets into a discussion of the brain again, because the portion of the brain that perceives smell is the olfactory lobe, which is positioned right towards the front of the brain. So when you reconstruct the anatomy of a bird's brain, you can tell very quickly whether the animal will have a well-developed sense of smell or not, just judging by the size of these olfactory lobes. And so many groups of birds don't have particularly well-developed olfactory lobes, whereas some are really super smellers. In fact, some groups of birds are completely dependent on being able to smell their food in order to make a living. And the group that comes to mind are New World vultures. So things like the turkey vulture. So if you were in North America, let's say, where I'm from, and you took, I don't know, a steak and buried it under leaves in the woods and walked away, probably within just a few days, as that steak started to turn, a turkey vulture would be able to pick up on it and find it even if it were covered up by leaves. So this is not something they'd be able to see visually. This is something they'd be able to hone in on just using their incredibly well-developed sense of smell.
Wow, yeah, I would have thought if you're looking out for those smells, you'd want to cut it off because it doesn't smell very nice. But that's probably the way that we view it.
That's right. This is a value judgment, Roz. I think to a turkey vulture, a rotten steak would be perfect.
So Finn asks, what's the most colourful bird? So you've mentioned a couple. Really,
wow. I'm sure there actually is a quantitative answer to that, but I'll try to think of some examples right off the top of my head. So one bird I've already mentioned today is the painted bunting, which is an incredible North American bird, which looks like, imagine a really fancy chaffinch, where instead of being sort of like subtly pinkish and subtly grayish and subtly greenish, it's bright pink and bright blue and bright green. So the painted bunting jumped out to me when I was 9 years old, when I was flipping through this National Geographic Guide to the Birds of North America, as the most audaciously colored bird I'd ever seen in my life. But if you actually go a little further south into Central America and Northern South America, you encounter the world's most diverse family of birds, which is a group called the tanagers. So there are over 400 living species of tanagers, and they range from some of the least colorful birds you can possibly imagine to some of the most audaciously, spectacularly colored birds. One of them, very appropriately named, is called the paradise tanager. And the paradise tanager is like a magical version of the painted bunting. So it's got green on the face, which is incredibly vibrant, extremely bright blue, bright red on the back, and all of this contrasts with extremely black feathers. So these black feathers actually serve a really important purpose by absorbing light surrounding these very colorful patches, which really serves to highlight just how incredibly vibrant and colorful the other patches around the body of the paradise tanager are. There are some other incredible birds. So thinking about hummingbirds again, here at Cambridge, we teach something called the Tropical Ecology Field Course, where we take third-year zoology and plant sciences students to the tropics to learn about biodiversity and ecology in the world's most biodiverse corners. And last year, not this year, but the year before, we were in Panama, so right where Central America meets Northern South America, which is an amazing place to see things like tanagers, but also an amazing place to see things like hummingbirds. And one of the hummingbirds that I saw when I was in Panama with the Tropical Ecology Field Course is called the fiery-throated hummingbird, which has an iridescent throat, but if you see it from the right angle, it's like there's a rainbow on the throat of this bird. It's absolutely incredible. It just lights up, and I've never seen anything like it. It's a truly spectacular bird.
Oh, fantastic. I'd love to see some of these in the wild. They'd be
Yeah,
amazing.
absolutely.
So we've also got a question. What's the rarest bird in the world? Is that quite hard to quantify?
It's a good question because there are probably some strong contenders. Of course, when it comes to things that are truly extremely rare, it can become very difficult to differentiate between whether something is incredibly rare or actually extinct. So in some cases, a bird may not have been seen for many years, even many decades, and then it can be rediscovered, and generally still rare, but nonetheless still present. So there are probably a number of contenders for birds that unfortunately are right on the brink of extinction. But just thinking about this Tropical Ecology Field Course again, one example comes to mind. So this past year in 2023, the Tropical Ecology Field Course went to Borneo, which is really amazing. And of course, Borneo is part of the Malay archipelago. And just west of Borneo, we have the island of Java, the Indonesian island of Java. And close to Java, we have the Indonesian island of Bali, where there's a fascinating bird called the Bali starling. So the Bali starling, or the Bali myna, of course, is related to our common starling, but it looks completely different. Its plumage is completely white, and it's got a bright blue patch of skin around the eye. It's an incredible looking bird. There are only a very small handful of these Bali starlings left in the wild, unfortunately. There are far more Bali starlings around the world in captive breeding programs than there are in the wild. And this has to do with the fact that much habitat has been lost on the island of Bali due to development over the past several decades, and as a result, the Bali starling is unfortunately really critically endangered.
Yeah. Oh, that's sad. It sounds amazing. I have to find
It's
a
an
picture
amazing,
of it. It sounds
amazing
incredible.
bird, yes.
So TP asks, did birds have arms instead of wings once?
Well, the ancestors of birds certainly did. So not only are birds dinosaurs, birds evolved from within a particular group of dinosaurs that we call the theropod dinosaurs, which are the three-toed, meat-eating dinosaurs, the group that includes things like T-Rex and Velociraptor. And specifically within theropod dinosaurs, birds evolved from a group called the Maniraptorans. And these Maniraptor theropod dinosaurs had really well-developed hands for grasping, probably grasping their prey because they were clearly carnivorous dinosaurs. But throughout the evolutionary history of Maniraptor dinosaurs, some important changes evolved, including changes related to flight. And one group of dinosaurs, of Maniraptor dinosaurs, that are particularly closely related to birds happens to be the group that includes Velociraptor. So this group is called the Dromaeosaurs, or the raptor dinosaurs. And Velociraptor and its kin are very interesting because instead of being able to move their hands around like this, a specialization that modern birds show that allows birds to fold their wings all the way back, their hands all the way back along their forearms in order to roost and get their wings out of the way, first evolves. So it's within this group of relatives of Velociraptor that we start to see this transition towards hands and arms that are beginning to look much more like the wings of birds. And it's from that point onward that additional specializations of the arms and the rest of the apparatus that powers the forelimbs became more and more wing-like during this transition to a flying mode of life.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, amazing what we can see from the fossil record as well. It's incredible. So I've got a question from Caleb. Which bird has the weirdest attribute?
Well, that's sort of a hard one to say. Again, it depends what you mean by weirdest, but one of the funniest looking birds, I think, is a bird you would have seen in the introductory video, the shoebill, which is a bird that I find really fascinating. It's also quite evolutionarily distinct. Its closest living relatives are pelicans and another strange bird that lives in Africa called the hammercob. But no bird in the world has a face quite like a shoebill. And not only does it have a crazy looking bill, I think the expression on the face of the shoebill is particularly amusing because it always looks like it's judging something, you know. It always seems very grumpy and unimpressed. But to me, that's one aspect of the shoebill that is particularly unusual. Now, the shoebill comes from Central Africa, and thinking about the shoebill reminds me of another very distinct, unusual bird from the savanna of Africa, and that's a bird called the secretary bird. And the secretary bird is one of my favorite birds as well. It is a species of raptor, so almost like a hawk or an eagle, so it's a predatory bird, but it has really long legs, unlike the relatively short legs of other predatory birds. And it has specialized hard pads on the soles of its feet, which it uses to catch its preferred prey, which are snakes. So secretary birds, when they hunt, they run around, find a snake, and try to kick it to death before they eat it. And that is not only unusual for a bird, it's a very unusual mode of life for pretty much any animal.
How did that evolve?
It is a strange and very divergent creature.
Yeah.
So the times that I've been to East Africa and Central Africa have been particularly exciting because there are opportunities to catch up with some of these particularly evolutionarily distinct birds. So in addition to the Hoatzin in South America, seeing these really unusual birds like the shoebill and like the secretary bird, these are things that to me are like almost unbelievably cool.
Yeah.
There's absolutely nothing I enjoy more in the world than actually having a chance to observe these really incredible birds in the wild.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. So Zoe asks, which bird has the biggest population?
Again, that's a tricky one. There are a few contenders, but oftentimes, at least in terms of land birds, it's said to be a small species of bird called the red-billed quelea that lives in sub-Saharan Africa and feeds on grains. So the red-billed quelea will form absolutely enormous flocks. So secretary birds will no doubt have seen some of these absolutely incredible flocks of red-billed queleas that can almost darken the sky. So red-billed quelea has absolutely massive population size. I'm not exactly sure what the population is. Tens to hundreds of millions, I would say. It's an incredibly abundant bird in sub-Saharan Africa, but please don't quote me on the actual numbers. I'm sure those numbers are actually out there.
It sounds like it'd be quite hard to count them.
Yes. But there are marine birds that are incredibly abundant as well. And so many seabirds breed on really remote islands in sort of far off places. So my predecessor, of course, in the role of Strickland Curator of Ornithology at this museum, is a famous ornithologist named Dr. Michael Brook. And Michael Brook loves traveling around the world and visiting these remote breeding colonies to study seabirds when they come to land, which is something they only do to breed. And there's one species of seabird, a very tiny, small-bodied seabird, that breeds in the South Atlantic, on islands in the South Atlantic and around Antarctica, called Wilson's storm petrel, that apparently, reputedly, has such absolutely astronomical population size, it actually rivals red-billed quelea for being the world's most abundant bird. And so I think, depending on how the population sizes of these different species are quantified, it might be Wilson's storm petrel or it might be red-billed quelea. However, all that said, I think my answers are only true for wild birds. I think it's very safe to say that the world's most abundant species of bird is the chicken.
Yes.
Right? In an agricultural context, the chicken is, I I can't even remember, there's something like 25 billion chickens on planet Earth. It's kind of horrifying.
Yeah. Okay, we've got quite a few more questions actually.
Okay.
So, got one from Abby. Abby asks, why was the Spix macaw endangered?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So I'm not completely certain of all of the factors surrounding the population decline of Spix's macaw. But one factor that is common to population declines of many South American parrot species, like Spix's macaw, are trapping for the pet trade, quite unfortunately.
Yeah.
So demand for exotic pets and exotic parrots in particular led to a considerable amount of poaching, which has caused, unfortunately, population declines of many formerly common, sometimes formerly abundant, neotropical parrot species. And I'm not sure of the complete extent to which poaching for the pet trade was responsible for population declines of Spix's macaw, but I suspect it played some role.
Yeah.
Obviously, habitat loss, habitat transformation, especially for agriculture, is another really unfortunate factor that influences population declines, not only of parrots, but of many different species of birds all around the world.
Yeah, it's really sad. It's not an isolated story, that kind of thing, is it?
No, of course it's not. So it's not so hard to come up with probable answers to the question, but I would have to check about Spix's macaw specifically.
So Roberta asks, it's a bit more cheerful, which specimen in the museum collection has the most special place in your heart? Or is that too hard?
Well, again, that's not an easy question to answer, but I have had, since I started my role as the curator of ornithology here, some really exciting moments in the ornithology collections, because the collection of birds here at the University of Museum of Zoology is of almost incalculable scientific importance. This collection was accumulated almost entirely during the 19th century, which of course was a century in which so much of Earth's biodiversity was studied by scientists in this part of the world for the very first time. So our collection houses a very large number of species, specimens that were the very first specimens of their species ever to be scientifically described. And that is a very, very special thing for an ornithologist like myself to have the opportunity to engage with these specimens. Another aspect of the collections that's absolutely fascinating to me is the fact that because so many of these specimens were collected in the 19th century, a very long time ago, some of the species that these specimens represent are species that are either extremely rare today or are entirely extinct. And of course, it's sobering, it's quite sad to work with specimens representing species that aren't around anymore, but it's also, it really drives home how critically important these natural history museums are as repositories of nature, because if these specimens were not contained within collections like our own, they would be lost to science and human knowledge forever. And so the fact that it's still possible to study some of these incredible species is absolutely amazing. So there's one special bird that pops into my mind where seeing it in the collection was a total surprise and an absolute thrill. And it's a specimen, a particularly beautiful and well-preserved specimen of a tiny bird from eastern South America called the kinglet calyptura. And this kinglet calyptura, or calyptura, is almost certainly extinct now. It was only found in the Atlantic forest of southeastern Brazil and northeastern Argentina, but it hasn't been seen since, I think, the 1930s. And opening a drawer within the museum and seeing this incredibly beautifully preserved specimen of kinglet calyptura was an amazing moment for me. And of course, the value of these collections are in their ability, first of all, to inspire others and teach others, but also as sources of information for scientists. So I'm really happy to say that shortly after seeing this kinglet calyptura for the very first time, a world expert on that particular species named Guy Kirwan, who lives up in Norfolk, came down to examine the specimen, and he's just recently published on it in a big sort of revision of known specimens of that species. So, I mean, I could talk about amazing specimens in our collection literally all day, But the kinglet calyptra for me is one of these particularly special specimens that we have.
Okay, so I think we've got a few quick-fire ones.
Okay.
Yeah. So Finn asks, what is the biggest bird?
Well, the biggest living bird is the ostrich, but the largest bird to ever live was the elephant bird. So the elephant bird was an absolutely enormous bird. It went extinct probably in the last 1,000 years or so. It was only found in Madagascar, and an elephant bird would make an ostrich look absolutely puny.
Yeah, we've got an elephant bird egg on display at the moment as well, and
That's right.
like rugby ball sized.
And
so,
you should come and see this elephant bird egg while we have it, because it's on loan from its discoverer, Sir David Attenborough.
Yeah, it's a very special specimen. Alison asks, can you get birds in Antarctica? And if there are, which ones?
Well, there are birds in Antarctica, of course. It's maybe not a surprise to learn that the central part of Antarctica is not really hospitable for bird life or most life of any kind. But the most iconic bird found only in Antarctica is probably the emperor penguin. Because the emperor penguin, unlike much of Antarctica's bird life, doesn't spend its time sort of around the periphery on the Antarctic Peninsula at higher latitudes, at lower latitudes. The emperor penguin breeds and spends its life right on the Antarctic continent itself, and so it really lives in an incredibly remote place, and the lifestyle of an emperor penguin is absolutely among the very most bizarre and awe-inspiring ways to live.
Yeah, we felt it was
any
cold.
Bird shows.
We felt it was cold today, but it's nothing compared to the Antarctic winter.
No.
Yeah, nothing.
I think an emperor penguin would have overheated in Cambridge
Yes,
today.
yeah. Also, which species of birds has the most feathers? Are there any that are particularly feathery?
Oh, yeah, I'm a little bit embarrassed because I'm not totally sure off the top of my head. I mean, even tiny little birds like wrens have tons of feathers, like 10,000 or something like that, right? Birds really pack on those downy feathers. It wouldn't surprise me if some of the most densely plumaged birds were in fact penguins, because density of things like downy plumage helps trap warm air close to the body. So my guess is probably going to be the emperor penguin, just because not only is it a penguin, but it's also large. But that's something I'm going to have to look up afterwards. That's quite a good question.
Yeah, it's a good question. What percentage of birds can't fly? Because we've got a few, don't we?
A tiny percentage. So especially of extant birds, it's less than 1%. But in the past, in the relatively recent past, it was a much higher percentage. So flightlessness is something that we see evolving among birds, usually when birds end up on remote islands, places that don't have any ground-dwelling predators. And so flightlessness evolved many, many, many dozens of times independently on oceanic islands in places like the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. But unfortunately, so many of these birds that transitioned to flightlessness on these oceanic islands have been driven to extinction since those islands have been discovered by sailors, especially European sailors, who either tended to eat those species into oblivion because they're relatively easy to catch, or I think much more commonly introduced pests, things like rats, things like cats, and things like dogs that devastated populations, native populations of flightless birds on these oceanic islands around the world. So if you were asking me this question, let's say 1,000 years ago, I mean, there may literally have been hundreds of now extinct species of flightless birds that unfortunately in 2023 are not around anymore. But this museum, another fascinating thing about it from a bird specimen perspective, is that this museum is one of the world's most important repositories for fossil remains of flightless birds like the dodo, and a very similar bird that lived on the island of Rodriguez called the Rodriguez solitaire. So the University of Museum of Zoology at Cambridge has absolutely world-class holdings of dodo and solitaire material. So it's a place that specialists interested in the evolution and extinction of these iconic flightless birds will come to study those remains.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions on eggs, and then,
Okay.
and then we'll finish with one on a particularly wintry bird.
Okay.
And we've got a couple of questions. If we haven't managed to answer them all, we'll try and pop some answers on our blog, because we have had loads today, which is fantastic. Great to see your curiosity. So we've got 2 questions on eggs. One is, did or do birds always lay eggs? And the other is, which species of bird lays the most eggs in one go?
Oh, those are great questions. So first of all, the answer is yes, all birds lay eggs. Now, interestingly, some groups of reptiles exhibit a real propensity for evolutionarily transitioning from egg laying to giving live birth. And this is something that has evolved literally dozens of times independently among lizards and snakes. So ancestrally, lizards and snakes were egg layers, but independently, many, many different times, live birth has evolved. It's much more impressive than what happened in mammals, where a single evolutionary transition to live birth evolved. Now, birds have never done that. Birds lay eggs, and no species of bird has ever evolved the capacity to give live birth. And that's actually really quite fascinating, because there are certain ecological contexts in which giving live birth might be selectively advantageous. For instance, if you're a marine bird and you spend almost your entire life out at sea, maybe it would be really nice to just be able to give birth while you're at sea instead of coming back to some sort of oceanic island in order to breed. Nonetheless, for reasons we don't completely understand, birds have never evolved the capacity to bear live young.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Yeah, fascinating. It is one of those things I've always wondered about. Why do they always lay eggs?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question mechanistically, and there's probably an answer to that question, maybe an answer that remains to be found.
Yeah. Okay, so our last question then, this is from Elias. How can the robin survive in places with temperatures under 0 degrees centigrade?
Well, it's not easy. I think it's important to recognize that winter, this cold weather, can be incredibly challenging for a warm-blooded animal like a small passerine bird, a small songbird like a robin. But they have some really amazing tricks up their sleeves, or rather in their coats. They are extremely well insulated. And one of the tricks that birds like a robin will pull out when it gets particularly cold is fluffing themselves up. And so you might notice birds doing that, fluffing themselves up and turning themselves into little sort of ping pong ball looking fluff balls when it gets really, really cold. And they do that for a very good reason. Of course, fluffing up their feathers increases the size and the number of air pockets within their plumage close to the body that can trap warm air and keep that warm air close to the body. So that's one behavioral strategy that small birds like robins will perform in order to stay warm when it gets cold. But of course, in order to keep their internal body temperatures high, robins and other small passerine birds like blue tits and great tits and wrens and long-tailed tits and goldfinches and chaffinches, you name it, they need to eat quite a lot. And so during the short and sometimes very cold winter days, these birds will spend almost all of their time foraging for food in order to give themselves the fuel that they need to keep their internal body temperatures up, which they can then try to hold on to by improving their insulation by fluffing themselves up.
Thank you so much for that. That brings us on really nicely to something a little bit later, but thank you so much. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you, Roz.
I've learned so much. I love birds and I've learned so much more. It's been great.
That's great. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. It was really fun.
Yeah, and sorry we're overrunning a little bit because there were just so many great questions. I couldn't resist asking them. But now it's nearly time to share the results of our winter strategies. You know, so the feeding and the fluffing up and everything, like really good winter strategies. So nearly time for the results of our poll. But before that, here's a very short poem from our young zoologists and poet Hannah Walker.
If you are the brambling, I'll be the woodland. If you are the hedgehog, I'll be the leaves. If you are the owl, I'll be the tree. If you are the pheasant, I'll be the long grass. If you are the mouse, I'll be the straw. If you are the tortoise, I'll be the shell. If you are the woodlouse, I'll be the corner. If you are the eagle, I'll be the mountain.
Okay, so now it is time for the results of our poll, and we have a joint winner. So we've got two that have come out on top. Store food like a squirrel has 42%, and hibernate like a hedgehog has 42%. And then joint third, migrate like a butterfly and huddle like a ladybird are both 8%. So our mammals have really won out today. So that's almost it for another Winter Wildlife live stream, and we hope that you've enjoyed it. If you want to find out more about winter birds, you can check out Daniel's film from Mill Road Cemetery that you can find on our YouTube channel. You'll be really surprised by how many species of birds you can find there at this time of year. And then we have posts on winter wildlife and what you can do to support it in your own green spaces as well, all on our blog. So that's museumofzoologyblog.com. A big thank you to everyone who's contributed today. And we're going to finish with a film that includes some soundscapes made by members of our zoology club for 13 to 18-year-olds. We hope to see you again online or in the museum soon.